For the better part of last year, I spent a lot of time wondering if at some point I had come across a monkey's paw without realizing it. I remember spending just about every day at my job silently lamenting the fact that between work and spending most of my weekends playing games with friends, I was so starved for me time that none of it actually went towards making my next video. If only, I cried. If only I had some magical way to clear up more time in my schedule, I could do all the things I spend my day saying that I'm going to and then never do once I get home because I'm usually too exhausted. Oh boy. So, thanks to current events, I suddenly and unexpectedly got approved to work from home, which cleared up both my commute time and my lunch hour, and what with not wanting to risk the health of me and those around me to go play card games every week, I suddenly found myself with the free time on my hands that I had been so desperately wanting. Naturally, I squandered the hell out of this time playing video games and catching up on TV shows instead. Because if I was truly the responsible person I like to pretend to be, this video would have come out a lot sooner than a year after my last one. Of course, it didn't help that in the closing of my last video, I committed to the idea that this one would be about one of two topics that thus far had not been able to provide me with more than a vague idea of what I would want to discuss. So I tucked the ideas into the back of my mind and went back to ignoring the existence of my channel. That is, until I played a game that brought back some feelings that I had had when I made my first video. Specifically the feeling of, boy, this is neat. I want to tell people about it so they can get more attention. And it just so happens that there's a perfect platform to do that with. So yeah, let's talk about Degrees of Separation. I first discovered this game when it was featured on one of Nintendo's The Download segments, wherein they show off games that have recently been made available on the eShop. The colorful nature of the game caught my eye, as did the fact that it was immediately apparent that it was intended to be a co-op experience. And while my wife Barbie is mostly a fan of having me play games so that she can experience a story without having to put in the work, we do occasionally enjoy a good co-op game. With the exception of Eve and Ob, which was a fantastic way to test our conflict resolution skills in the early days of our relationship. We never finished that one, and by the grace of God, I don't ever intend to. But after a few years, I figured, what the hey, this looks worth any potential hassle, and it could be a fun way to have a stay-at-home date night now that going out to see a movie isn't really in the cards anymore. So with that in mind, we each took a controller in hand and set out to see what the world of Degrees of Separation had to offer. As I mentioned before, the colorful art style is what initially drew my attention, and it's likely the first thing that you'll notice when starting up the game. The contrast between the cool blues and the warm oranges creates this gorgeous visual effect, which is reinforced by the characters that the players are in control of, Ember and Rhyme. Both player characters have these simple yet distinctive designs that play off of each other wonderfully, and through visuals alone manage to reinforce the ideas behind both the world and the gameplay. You see, Degrees is a puzzle platformer in which each player's presence on one side of the screen contains either Ember's world of warmth or Rhyme's world of cold. These worlds follow each other but cannot cross over, and this idea is what drives the bulk of the game's puzzles, save for one level involving magic wands and calculating angles that help to remind me that pre-calculus was the first course that I ever managed to flunk. Each level of the game is filled with a number of scarves to collect, which are hidden behind puzzles that the players must work together to solve. Sometimes this can mean manipulating the screen so that a lake ends up in Rhyme's world, freezing and allowing him to walk across it, or ensuring that a lantern ends up in Ember's, lighting up and activating platforms. Later levels add a number of interesting twists to this formula that manage to keep the players on their toes as they try to figure out what they need to do to proceed. As the players collect these scarves, more levels will open up and become available to them along the lines of collecting power stars in a game like Mario 64. But in our case at least, opening up new levels was secondary to the joy of simply finding the scarves and solving the associated puzzles. The reward was the feeling of accomplishment that came with solving a particularly difficult challenge. Neither of us are completionists by any stretch of the imagination, but something about this game made us unwilling to leave a level behind with any scarves left unclaimed. And while the gameplay itself is fun and engaging, I would be remiss not to return to speaking about the game's presentation. In concert with the beautiful art style mentioned before, the entire game has this storybook style of presentation, and it lends no small amount of charm. The characters move in a manner that calls to mind paper cutouts and look like illustrations from a book of fairy tales, which, appropriately enough, ties into how the game presents its story. You see, Ember and Rhyme don't speak. Instead, their adventure is narrated by an unseen voice that dictates the events of the game as if it were a story being read to the player. As I understand, there are some who take issue with this style of storytelling, but the both of us really enjoyed how it contributed to the game's storybook atmosphere, and it lends another layer of charm to an already incredibly charming game. The story of Degrees of Separation is the tale of the two player characters. Ember, who comes from a world filled with warmth, and Rhyme, who comes from a world of cold. They both awaken one day from unusual dreams, in which Rhyme's world is filled with an uncharacteristic warmth, and Ember's is filled with a strange coldness. They set out to explore and find answers as to what could be going on, until they meet up with each other on a bridge which collapses and leaves them stranded together. As previously mentioned, Ember and Rhyme's worlds are separated from each other by some sort of invisible magical barrier. Though Ember and Rhyme cannot cross this barrier to reach each other, they still take joy in the companionship that the other provides as they adventure across unfamiliar landscapes. I'm sure that it wouldn't qualify as any sort of spoiler to say that there's romantic themes to this relationship, and it's why I feel that this game makes for an absolutely wonderful activity for a stay-at-home date night, which, for obvious reasons, are the only ones we've been able to manage for a while now. I won't go into too much detail about the story of the game because there's a real joy in seeing it play out for yourself and the person that you're playing it with, but suffice to say, I cannot recommend this game enough as a couch co-op experience. It's a game that's gone criminally unrecognized in the time that it's been out, and if this video can convince even a few people to give it a go, then that's good enough for me. Go play the game for yourselves and tell me what you think. As for me, I'm gonna go back to being lazy. I have a lot of anime to watch.